I thought I'd give just a really kind of brief introduction to show what's involved here.
Fantastic.
Right, yeah. And so I'm going to just take about 10 minutes and do that.
Beautiful.
And turn it over to you, and you can start going through the points and then the questions that you've outlined. What we're doing here really is working with major theories about politics. And what we find is that almost every, certainly political, every psychological model tends to come up with what it thinks constitutes the type of personality that we choose to be progressive versus the personality that we choose to be conservative. And they're trying to sort of identify what those factors are. And my point as we go through some of these is that there isn't really just one specific parameter that can decide what's left and what's right. That actually every element in a cosmic address exerts an influence on a person's political orientation. And so, as we'll see as we go through this, the quadrants, the levels, lines, different states, different types will have an impact on your political orientation. Some of them turn out to be really prevalent and important. Others turn out to be less prevalent, less important, but they all have some recognizable role to play in our political process. Mm-hmm. So by taking these all into account and letting each individual figure out, okay, if that's the definition of left and right, then where do I fall in that? And then, okay, if this next definition of left and right, then where do I fall in that? And then when you're done, you're going to start to have a pretty good sense about how all the different types of theories that have been proposed to account for political orientations. You'll have a better sense of where you are in all of those. And also then we can also all start to draw some ideas about, well, how would this impact national or international politics if we actually start taking all these factors into account? Because they're all there and they're all having an important impact on this process. And so we need to at least be aware of that. So I'll give you some examples of theories that already exist and have been proposed by very, very legitimate people. And you'll start to get a sense about what I mean in terms of these different theories trying to explain political orientation. So if we take one based on types, for example, and look at how types affect political orientation, probably the most widely accepted conventional model of psychology is called the Big Five factor analysis. And this is basically just a flat out statistical analysis of the types of personality, types of temperament that individuals have. So they basically just sort of put everybody on the table, did an analysis of all their temperament types, and then analyzed the ones to see which ones were constant and most important. And then once they had those, then they could take people that had those types of temperament and then test them to see what their proclivities were, what their motivations were, what their political orientation was, that type of thing. So the Big Five, through a statistical analysis, came up with the idea that there are 5 major types. And that's why it's called Big Five factor analysis. And these factors are summarized by the acronym OCEAN. So O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E is for extroversion, introversion. A is for agreeableness, and N is for negative emotions or neuroticism. And so with those factors, you then take people that are progressive and you see which of those temperaments they tend to express most. And then you take conservatives and see which of those temperaments they tend to express most. And what you find is that progressives are high on openness and low on conscientiousness. And openness does include things like creativity, and openness also implies being open to new ideas and wanting to improve things, that kind of thing. But conservatives are fairly low in openness, but they're high in conscientiousness, and particularly the subtype known as order. So according to the Big Five analysis, progressives are high in openness and conservatives high in order. So left, right, open, order makes a certain amount of sense. Mm-hmm. Jonathan Haidt, who's a very brilliant moral psychologist out of City University in New York, he refined this into around overall 5 different types. And what he found is that progressives tend to focus their moral decisions based on 2 principles. One is doing no harm to individuals, and that means no harm to everybody, basically. It's a world-centric orientation. And the second principle is fairness, treating all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And that's also a world-centric, universal, moral orientation. Mm-hmm. And then he found conservatives will use those 2, but they also use 3 others that most progressives don't. And in fact, many progressives feel negatively about them. Mm-hmm. But they were in-group loyalty, respect for authority, and group sanctity or group purity. And what you see there is that where the first 2, universally no harm and treating all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed, those are indeed world-centric. But these new principles, in-group loyalty, group sanctity, respect for authority in the group, those are more ethnocentric. Those are based on just your specific group. So there's a tension in that conservative orientation between world-centric and ethnocentric. And one of the questions that none of these major models answer is, how can you explain that difference? What was going on that allowed those different types of moral principles to emerge? And why do we see the higher ones in progressives, and we don't see any of the ethnocentric ones in progressives, but we do see them in conservatives? So we'll come back to that, and I'll give what I think is a plausible explanation for that. Then you have Jonathan Peterson, and his take on left and right is that, first of all, hierarchies are absolutely mandatory for any sort of human organization. And he points out actually that if you look in the animal kingdom, hierarchies go back for hundreds of millions of years. Mm-hmm. They weren't invented by capitalism or patriarchy or anything like that. And in fact, what he's talking about is what we integralists refer to as growth hierarchies. And growth hierarchies are absolutely mandatory. Even the simple sequence, starting from the Big Bang and going to quarks, and then to atoms, and then to molecules, and then to cells, and then to organisms, that's a growth hierarchy. It's a hierarchy of increasing complexity, increasing unity, increasing wholeness, and increasing inclusivity. Each higher stage in the growth hierarchy becomes more inclusive, not less inclusive. So when you move from atoms to molecules, molecules don't oppress atoms, they don't hate atoms, they don't exclude atoms. If anything, they enfold them. They actually include them in their own makeup. If anything, they love them. They're embracing them. It's, you know, so that's a very important sequence that we find in nature. And we find growth hierarchies in human developmental models all over the place. I mean, at least dozen or so multiple intelligences that human beings have, those all grow and develop through growth hierarchies, sometimes called holarchies. So those are very important. And Peterson is acknowledging that, and he refers to them as hierarchies of competence. And that's mostly how a society will decide that it wants to pursue a particular goal. And whatever that goal happens to be, some people are more gifted at it or more talented at it than others. That's pretty much unavoidable. So once a society has set particular goals and particular aims, some people will be better at those than others, so that they'll rise up the hierarchy of competency. And so those are necessary and those are important. And people on the right tend to see that those are important. And those conservatives on the right, that's what they want to do. They want to conserve those hierarchies because they recognize they're absolutely crucial to societal functioning. But any hierarchy can become corrupt. Any hierarchy can increase inequality and unfairness. And that becomes what we call dominator hierarchies. And those are all the horrible things that the left says they are. But the left, for Peterson, makes a mistake of, well, as I would word this part of it, they confuse dominator and growth hierarchies. There's no difference for them. All hierarchies are dominator hierarchies for the left. So their approach to hierarchies is get rid of all of them. They're all bad. Flatten all hierarchies. And so Peterson says, so these can both go too far. They can both be confused, but they're both working with a partial truth, which is conservatives want to conserve functioning hierarchies, and the left, seeing the inequality and the corruption, just wants to tear them all down. So the left, at least until recently, where there was a bit of a switch, and we'll talk about that, supported the working class, for example, because they were being downtrodden by these competence hierarchies. So for Peterson, ongoing dialogue between left and right is important because they both have true but partial correct ideas. So both of those have to be included. And then there are also some upper right studies of brain physiology, and they claim to measure a difference between progressive brainwave patterns and conservative brainwave patterns. So that's another quadrant-based type of political differentiation. What all of these lack is an ability well, what they all lack is the developmental component, which will allow us to see, for example, why there was this strange inversion in the 1960s when the original liberal left started to become illiberal, far left, green liberals. And so this was a big change. And it pointed out that what we call the left, which started with a liberal orientation, and about half of today's left has stayed with a liberal orientation. The progressive half, the leading edge components, have moved into green. And green actually doesn't like orange values. So it really doesn't like liberal values. It doesn't like free speech. It's perfectly glad to get rid of free speech in order to protect feelings of minorities. So it has a whole different priority system. And we'll talk about that when we get that altitude. So because of that, if we can bring in more of the actual elements that are impinging on a human being's awareness when they make political decisions, then we'll get a better sense about what's making up these different political orientations. So that's, in essence, what we want to talk about. And so with that, right, go ahead and turn it over to you, and we can start to go through some of these major and minor variables.
Yeah, awesome. Well, and as you were talking, Ken, and giving this sort of overview summary, I actually found a quote from Sex Ecology Spirituality that I think punctuates this nicely, and it's cool to see how consistent your observations have been over the decades. And here you say, the liberal then looks at the typical traditional amber conservative values, which are ethnocentric, nationalistic, and jingoistic, but which are adaptive and unavoidable at that stage, yet can easily slide into homophobia and gay bashing, sexism and misogyny, militarism and imperialism. And the liberals say, if those are what we mean by instilling values, then I'm staying out of the values game altogether, failing to see that its own world-centric fairness is simply the next stage in the next nested hierarchy or holarchy of unfolding values.
Right.
So I think that ties those sort of two pieces of your presentation together beautifully.